I don't know about you, but my longtime experience with preaching was one where I desperately wanted people to come alive to the wonder, the beauty, and transforming power of God's grace in Jesus. But the response wasn't what I expected. It wasn't what I at least hoped. And by grace, I eventually had this eureka moment that part of the problem wasn't that I wasn't preaching grace, but that I was preaching grace primarily as a fallback for failure and not preaching the fullness of grace as the fuel for spiritual change. And part of the problem was my 3-point sermon structure. Not that preaching 3 points is wrong, not at all, but a 3-point structure simply lacked the design that I had discovered in Scripture. When we look at the Bible story, the DNA, there are 4 strands. There's creation, there's the fall, there is redemption and restoration, with ultimate restoration being glorification. And I began thinking, if those are the 4 strands of DNA of the whole bigger meta-narrative story of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, then wouldn't we expect every piece of the story, the Scripture, themes, doctrines, topics, to all share that DNA? And if every Scripture shares the DNA of the meta-narrative, that means that every sermon can be a microcosm of that meta-narrative, of that overarching gospel story. And I began thinking, okay, so if the structure of that DNA story, if creation, corruption, fall, redemption, restoration, if that structure tells a story and the story has a structure, then wouldn't it make sense not only for the individual Scripture to have that DNA, but for my sermons to have that DNA and to even present that structure as I tell the story? And that way, a sermon can be a microcosm of the meta-narrative. It is an amazing thing that the bigger overarching story can be told week to week to week from every text, a different perspective. And so with that eureka moment, I went on a journey to figure out a way to preach like that. The result is the PPGR preaching system. So we don't say creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We have principle. And as we paint by the numbers, the principle is blue because it represents a universal truth, even a creational truth of what is and has always been true about God and about the way that God designed things to be good, true, and beautiful. And yet we move then to the problem, the fall or corruption. And this is a universal problem, a universal corruption issue concerning how the fall has affected issues related to the human condition and our own corruption. Whether we're dealing with issues from within our own flesh or whether we're having to respond to being the recipient of a broken world where we are being sinned against or simply experiencing the effects. That then moves us to the third part of the story and the structure. If we have principle, we have problem, now we're going to the gospel. This is an individual redemptive opportunity for us who now see the truth, recognize our need, and are now beholding the hero. Because as a story is told, you have a stage, the creational stage, the principle. You then move on to the conflict of the corruption and the problem. And then we now come to the hero. And that's why it's gold. He is our hero. Through his substitutionary life and death and resurrection, he is our hope, through whom we have justifying grace, adopting grace, and then once we have received him, we have the capacity to experience the fourth movement, the fourth color, which is sanctifying grace. That's why it's green. It is an amazing thing to be able to say that grace is not only a fallback for failure, it is the fuel for spiritual life. Again, in our course, you'll hear me say over and over again how John 15:4 and 5 represents the organic dynamic of spiritual change. We want to have that very clearly, securely in our minds and our hearts, especially when we get to this movement. Because what we're doing now is we're showing how specific ways that restoration takes place as we live in union with Jesus as our justifier, how that impacts the motive for our lives and how it reorients our desires and provides us with a new power to live in the new way of the Spirit. So the old way, flesh, law. New way, Spirit, gospel. Motivated by grace, empowered by the Spirit. And so here is how we have these movements where there is a development in the message. It's not just three independent explanatory points. It's not a lecture. This is a drama being told through movements in a story as we paint this gospel masterpiece. We are revealing the blue, the red, the gold, and the green. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture where people are being helped in what it looks like to live in union with Jesus and to be convinced that grace is not merely a fallback for failure. It really is the fuel for spiritual change.